Good evening, everyone. My name is Pooya and Eslani, and I want to welcome you to another episode of the Woman Life Freedom Manifesto podcast. This podcast is a part of a broader project to imagine and build the foundation for a future democratic republic in Iran. One based on justice, equality, and liberty as non-domination. Our goal is to not only to resist the current regime, but to construct a viable, participatory, post-authoritarian framework for governance and civic life. Since December, we have published 3 manifestos with 7 more planned to begin shaping this vision. Each of these texts offers building block for what we hope can become a non-dominant social contract for Iran. The first manifesto addresses legitimacy, what makes a government rightfully hold power. The second is about liberty, understood not simply as the absence of interference, but as a protection from arbitrary domination. The third focuses on equality, justice, and human rights, not as an abstract ideal, but as a real condition that a democratic system must protect for all citizens. We invite all Iranians, regardless of background or ideology, to engage with these manifestos, to critique them, and to contribute their own perspective. This is not a closed project. It's an open invitation to participate in defining our shared future. To get involved or to simply follow the project, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter at iranlifeandliberty.com. You'll find all published manifestos there and information on how to contribute. If you have a specific interest or an area of expertise, we are actively inviting people to help write the remaining 7 manifestos. Our group started with just 2 people, Susan Raksh and myself, and it had grown gradually through dialogue and collaboration. We now have about 10 members, and some of whom are with us here today. Today's session is a little different. Instead of a standard podcast recording, we are holding an open public conversation with participation from scholars, activists, and members of the public. This format was proposed by Susan Raksh, and I want to thank her for that vision. I had originally imagined a traditional podcast, but Susan encouraged us to make this more interactive and more collective. So here's how the format will work. I'll begin with 2 opening questions for our guest, Professor Sherry Berman. And after that, we open the floor for questions from participants. You're welcome to raise your hand to ask your questions live. Or if you prefer, you can write your questions in that chat, even in Farsi, and I'll do my best to translate them in English. Please keep your questions short so we can include as many voices as possible. Professor Sherry Berman is a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and one of the most important scholars working on the history of democracy, the development of European left, and the challenges of authoritarianism in the modern world. Her work spans academic books, essays, and public commentary, including articles in foreign policy, the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Persuasion. In particular, she has written about the ideological and practical differences between social democracy, Marxism, democratic socialism, and other traditions on the left, helping us understand not just where these come from, but what they will still have to offer in the 21st century. We are honored to have her with us today. Professor Berman, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and participating in this Q&A. And I would like to start the conversation by asking you 2 questions. First, could you help clarify the distinction between the social democracy and other leftist traditions like Marxism, communism, and democratic socialism? You addressed this clearly in one of your articles published in Foreign Policy, which we have translated and shared it in our website. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I love to hear from you. Explain what do you see as the core principles that define the social democratic tradition, especially through the 21st century? And building on that, how does social democracy understand liberty? How's the distinction in that approach to positive and negative liberty, which is my personal interest about that, especially through the lens of non-domination. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how social democracy addresses the risk of majority domination, and how can we build institutions that do not just empower people, but also protect them from arbitrary power. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you. And those are really, really, really big questions. So let me start with the first part of your question, and then I can try to move on to the second. So the first part is a kind of background question. There's lots of different traditions on the left. And if we look not just in Europe, but across the globe, lots of parties that are ostensibly on the left that have very different names: social democratic parties, socialist parties, communist parties, labor parties, yada, yada, yada. So to some degree, sort of the names are, sort of historically conditioned, but there are, I think, very important and distinct traditions on the left. And both for intellectual and practical reasons, I think it's important to think about what those are. And I would say the best way to do that is to take sort of the two, or what are probably the two main or key features of the modern era, and think about how different groups on the left have addressed them. And those two key things are, I would say, capitalism and democracy. So if we take those two sort of constituent elements of the modern world, right, we can see that the left has actually approached these things in very different ways. So if we go back to Marx, kind of the godfather of the modern left, he had a vision that said capitalism was absolutely doomed to disappear, but that would happen entirely as a result of sort of the development of the economy, right? So it was inevitable. The economic development pushed history through different phases. Those phases had their own particular forms of class conflict embedded in them. And this thing was a kind of Darwinian process. And, capitalism was kind of bound to collapse as a result of its internal contradictions and the class conflicts that it generated. So in this view, politics was really unimportant. It wasn't a view of historical development that saw politics as central. It wasn't a version of historical development that saw political actors as central. It was a version of historical development that, again, was kind of very Darwinistic, evolutionary, in conjunction with other intellectual trends at the time. Now, in Marx's view, therefore, the role of political parties was really just to kind of prepare workers for this coming transition, which in his view, by the way, was coming in the not too distant future. Now, the problem with this was that by the end of the 19th century, it was clear that these predictions were not coming true. Capitalism wasn't collapsing. In fact, it seemed by the end of the 19th century to kind of have developed renewed vigor. And this left people on the left with some real problems. So that's the kind of backdrop. And so in response to that, you can see these different strands emerging on the left. So one strand, that's the strand that's probably best epitomized by Lenin and would develop into communism. That strand was like, look, capitalism is terrible. We've got to get rid of it. But if it's not going to disappear on its own, then we have to sort of push history forward through the efforts of a revolutionary vanguard, right? So this took the disappearance of capitalism as a necessity. It was terrible, it was evil, but it was a vision of the left that was very much focused on the importance of politics. Capitalism needed to be destroyed by a revolutionary vanguard. These people had no interest in democracy. They did not think it was either important or powerful. And so their view was, yes, capitalism has to go, but no to democracy. Instead, it was a revolutionary vanguard that was going to kind of push history forward. That's the communist tradition. Then there was another tradition, and this was the tradition that was probably dominant in Europe, continental Europe, up through the early 20th century. And this was a tradition that I would call the democratic socialist tradition. So these folks also did not like capitalism. They thought it was terrible, it was evil, it had very few redeeming qualities. But they were not willing to use dictatorial, revolutionary vanguard tactics to overthrow it. So they thought, look, it's terrible. It's got to go. But we're going to play by the democratic rules of the game and wait for this thing to happen, even if Marx was wrong about it happening in the near future. So these people played by the democratic rules of the game, but they did not believe that democracy was a priority, either because they thought it alone could bring a better future into being, or because they thought it had the power to fundamentally change, the terrible conditions that existed at the time. So these folks, I would call them democratic socialists because they believed in playing by the rules of the game, but they did not prioritize democracy. Now, what does this mean? This means that when democracy was threatened in Europe, these people were not willing to compromise in order to save democracy. So we can see this very clearly in a variety of European countries. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the sort of key example of this is the Dreyfus Affair, when French democracy is threatened. And many French socialists like, look, this isn't our problem. If democracy is going to fall because conservatives and the church are trying to overthrow it, this isn't our priority. We're not getting involved in this fight. We're not willing to compromise with bourgeois liberals to save it. It's just, it's just not our priority. We also saw this very common during the interwar period when democracy was threatened in places, again, like France or in Italy, when democratic socialists said, look, we're not willing to make compromises in order to save democracy. And those compromises generally involved making some kind of agreement with bourgeois liberals. So that's the second tradition. And that was the tradition, I would say, that was dominant in continental Europe up through the interwar period. The third tradition, which is the one that I would call social democratic and sort of became dominant after the Second World War, had a very different view of both capitalism and democracy from the Leninists and the democratic socialists. These people saw capitalism as producing very many bad outcomes, but they also saw capitalism as producing very many good outcomes, growth and innovation. And they were like, look, we actually think the best possible world would be one where we minimize the downsides of capitalism and maximize the upside. So they didn't think capitalism either could or should disappear. They recognized its downsides, but they thought you could actually also have its upsides. And the way you would do that is by using the democratic state. They believe that you could use a democratic state to actually minimize the downsides and maximize the upsides. So these folks not only had different views of capitalism than their democratic socialist and Leninist/communist counterparts did, they also had very different views of democracy. Unlike the Leninists and the communists, they prioritized democracy. But unlike their democratic socialist counterparts, they actually believed democracy could not only fundamentally change things, but they also believed it was a good in and of itself. And what did that mean? That meant that when, push came to shove and democracy was threatened, that they would actually prioritize democracy over other things. So this meant, for instance, during the Dreyfus Affair, being willing to ally with bourgeois forces, even though those bourgeois forces were not interested necessarily in the same economic policies or outcomes that they were. It meant during the interwar years, again, being willing to kind of push back to the back burner some of their economic preferences in order to protect democracy. So democratic socialists had a very different view of democracy and a very different view of capitalism than those other traditions did. And that was the tradition, that sort of democratic socialist, that social democratic tradition that finally became dominant in Europe during the post-war period. During the interwar years, you sort of had a contest in Europe among these three different traditions. Of course, in places like Russia, the communist tradition won. In places like Italy, unfortunately, the democratic socialist tradition kind of ended up being predominant, although there was obviously strong communist parties. But it's that sort of social democratic one, the one that thinks that you can have the upsides of capitalism and minimizing your downsides, and that in order to do that, you have to really have a powerful, activist, but democratic state. So those are the sort of, I would say, the three main modern traditions, that is to say, post-Marx traditions that have existed on the Western left. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question about sort of social democracy and positive versus negative liberty, I think there's a bunch of different ways, again, we could think about this. So social democrats thought about, or I would say thought that both the negative and positive versions of liberty were important. They didn't see them as necessarily contradictory. So they didn't believe in, a state that was overly, to use your terms, kind of interfering or dominant, but they did believe in a state that had to be willing and able to produce the contexts, let me say, or the circumstances within which real democracy could flourish. And for social democrats, not surprisingly, since they came from a sort of Marxist background, those conditions had a lot to do with economics. So for instance, social democrats maintain that you could not have a real democracy if economic resources could easily be translated into political resources or power, right? So they believed that if you really wanted to have a true democracy, you needed to have a state that was willing to ensure that economic resources did not get translated into political resources. They also believe that you couldn't have a true democracy if some people were so insecure or so poor or so undereducated that they actually couldn't be real citizens in a democracy. That is to say, they wouldn't have the time or the ability to have the kind of knowledge or participation skills that were necessary to make democracy work well. So they also believe that the state had a role to play in creating those kind of conditions, right? So social democrats believed in the importance of some kind of negative liberty. That is to say, some kind of understanding that political power should not be allowed to dominate citizens to the point where it threatened their liberty. But it also believed that the state had to do more than simply protect against, sort of whatever, interference or domination. The state had to be willing and able to create conditions in which true democracy could function. And that meant primarily, but not exclusively, not allowing economic resources to be translated into political resources and making sure citizens had the economic circumstances or lived in the economic circumstances that enabled them to be full, participatory, knowledgeable citizens. So, that's something that differed, that differentiated, for instance, social democrats from their liberal, with a small L, liberal counterparts who focused much more on negative liberty than on a state capable of creating the conditions within which a sort of full democracy could flourish. So let me stop there, since that was a kind of long monologue, and see if that needs to be clarified somehow.
Sure. I guess at this point, I would like actually, since we are not that many people, so if everybody opens their camera and they ask the question themselves, then that would be a better conversation, although I have a few other questions that I can ask. Professor Bathoui, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Pooya, for organizing this session, and thank you so much, Professor Berman, for all the text you have written and all the speech that you have had. So I have enjoyed really from your books, your articles, your TED Talks, and so on, and I have used them in many ways. So thank you so much. The first question that I had about the issue that you have written in this foreign policy article is about the nationalism and the progressive nationalism that you know much more than me, that Swedish Social Democrats have used during the 30s, and it was more inclusive nationalism than the Trump's exclusionary nationalism. And my question is the first one: what's your opinion about using this kind of progressive, leftist, inclusionary nationalism to attract people from all kinds of working class, minority, women, and so on and so forth?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So for those people who are not as perhaps knowledgeable about Swedish history, let me just say a couple of background words. So obviously the interwar period is not the same as today, but there are some similarities, and one was this kind of contest between a sort of a far right that was extremely nationalist, and in some cases, sort of National Socialist and fascist, and obviously small d Democrats and and other folks on the left. And one of the things that made Sweden distinctive during this time was that the Social Democrats not only recognized the threat from the right, but recognized that if they wanted to cut off the attractiveness of the right, they could not ignore the appeal of nationalism, but rather they needed to co-opt and reshape it for their own needs, right? So sometimes for folks on the left, we look at nationalist appeals and we just find them so abhorrent or so irrational that we sort of, we kind of push them aside and say, look, these are terrible things. And so we're just going to ignore them. But the problem with that is that they are often very attractive to folks. And rather than dismissing those folks, what probably makes more sense, both from a practical as well as a intellectual perspective, is to think about what's attractive there and try to use that to the advantage of progressive goals. And the Swedish Social Democrats were really very successful about that. Actually, I would say more successful than any other left-wing party during the interwar years. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that they took this nationalist appeal of the right and they adopted it and turned it into something that could be used for progressive goals. And so they sort of took this idea of Sweden as a national home. Folkhemmet is the term in Swedish, right? Which actually had been a term that was developed on the right. That wasn't something that the Swedish left came up with on their own. They actually took this term from the left, the idea of Sweden as a national home, and they said, well, what does that really mean? Or what should that really mean? A home is someplace where everybody is comfortable and supported, where people take care of each other, and where we work together for kind of common goals. And so they use this idea as a way to kind of encapsulate their vision of a more equal Sweden, of a Sweden where the government created conditions, economic and other kinds of conditions, where all citizens could thrive, and where divisions among people didn't matter. Now, again, in the 30s, in a place like Sweden, those divisions were class differences, right? And I think it's a little hard for us today, regardless of where we come from, to sort of recognize how really deep those divisions were in Europe, or in a place like Sweden in particular, which was not a wealthy European country at that time, how deep those class divisions were. They were more than simply economic divisions. They were deeply cultural divisions. They were deeply social divisions. They were obviously, of course, deeply educational divides as well. And so the idea is that if we want Sweden to be a real home, to be a cohesive and powerful nation, we need to create division. We need to create the circumstances within which those divisions will be lessened. So that's the inclusive nationalism. It's a nationalism that takes seriously people's feeling for their national community, their desire to be part of a larger whole, but it turns it into a way to encourage people to participate in a project that diminishes differences, that legitimizes a government that can put in place policies that overcome divisions, that create opportunities for all citizens, regardless of their class backgrounds, or today I would say ethnic, religious, or other kinds of backgrounds, within which everyone can flourish as long as they are committed to that national project. So that was very much a part of the Swedish social democratic appeal, and that term folkhemmet became embedded in the kind of modern Swedish consciousness to such a degree that it continued to sort of resonate as a sort of idea, as a sort of concept that defined what Sweden was up through the post-war period. Tragically, of course, this is now something that the right has used to bludgeon the Swedish left, saying that they've forgotten what that folkhemmet actually meant, and sort of have abandoned the actual principles that they were so strongly advocates of during the 1930s. But I think the point that you're trying to get at is, look, as a person of the left, there is a very strong tradition of poo-pooing or dismissing the appeal of nationalism, But there is a tradition on the left, and the Swedes would be a good example of that historically, that have tried to turn that appeal towards national solidarity in a progressive way. I would say that that is a tradition that was sadly lost on the left during the last decades of the 20th century, and that created a real opportunity for forces on the right to recapture that theme, that desire for some kind of national solidarity, and use it for non-progressive purposes.
If I may, I can give an example. In the current days, I had a speech for the athletic movements, organize the athletic activities for the young people in all the suburb of Sweden. You know that suburb are for the people of poor background. And I seated the Per Albin Hansen and the Folkhemmet and told them, look, here is somebody whose name is Ali Reza and wanted to sit Per Albin Hansen. And they laughed. But I told them, if we want to have this community, this society in a safe way, if we want to be together, we should look at these young people in the suburb that have no opportunity for athletic activities and so on. And if we organize this in this way, so we can reconstruct this folkhemmet and integrated them to this national project. And I think that the left has this opportunity to go back to this tradition, to include the people who had been excluded, because the right wing, the reactionary nationalism, they says that we should arrest these young people, we should give it them out to their home and so on. But we can say that, look, they are born here, they are part of the society. How can we can use their energy, their youthhood and so on. So I mean, there is yet some kind of opportunity for left to use this tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is true, and in fact necessary. And I would say, you know, sort of there are several challenges facing the European left today, but this is not just a European issue. I think this challenge, and I know this exists in Iran too, of taking people from diverse backgrounds, whatever those backgrounds are, whether they're ethnic diversity, whether it's religious diversity, right? And it's not a question of asking people to give up those parts of who they are, but it's asking both them and, you know, whatever the majority, let's say, population is, to figure out ways to kind of find the common themes or the common commitments that can allow a national project to flourish. Because whatever you may think about, you know, sort of a kind of future international community, the reality is that we live now in a world of nation states. Those are the places where democracy happens. Those are the places where welfare states are. And so we have to figure out a way to join a commitment to that national project that does not require people to give up their, you know, sort of individual or communal characteristics, but enables them to see beyond that to something that they share with their fellow citizens. And again, in the past, in a place like Sweden, which was really quite homogenous, obviously in the 1930s, those divisions were economic, they were class divisions. Today, they're less economic, although those things exist. But layered on to that, of course, are folks who come from a variety of different, again, ethnic, religious, linguistic backgrounds, and figuring out a way to kind of make them part of that national project is really crucial, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to get some of those good things that you had in the past back. Strong welfare states, states that were trusted and legitimate enough to actually carry out, you know, major projects of national reconstruction, you know, law and order, that is to say something that nobody wants to live in a community where people feel unsafe. The kind of trust that requires people to have a level of fellow feeling that really needs to be reconstructed in a lot of places today, Europe, the United States, elsewhere.
Yeah, I know that, you know, sure, that it was not only the government of Sweden, but the social movements on the bottom that included in 30s, and now it's the same craft of the civil society organization or social movement in the bottom that can be a kind of vehicle for this inclusion as well. Sorry.
No, absolutely.
No, I just wanted actually to, in continuation of this discussion, I guess I have a deeper question. And the question is, I mean, you mentioned about the word democracy many times, but what does it mean? I mean, my question is, okay, what was the people? I mean, you mentioned state, you mentioned democracy, but I think, and still at the end of the day, we talk about the people's diversity. So what was the intention, let's say after the Second World War? What was the definition of people in European states? Who were the people? I mean, back then, obviously, you didn't have that many immigrants. Now in Europe, you have many people that they are obviously ethnically diverse. And then I guess the question is, as much as we talk about democracy, the question is, but still they are not going to be accepted as the people, because we do have more or less the same issue in the United States, right? So we the people, but the people were basically white men. And then the whole structural system was designed as such that at some point you're going to vote. The problem is that, for instance, in the US, the Democratic Party, the people generally speaking vote for them. The blacks, sometimes the Latinos, even Middle Eastern, up to this election, they are culturally, you could argue, they are very conservative people. But for whatever reason, they have been voted for a Democratic Party. Now you have basically a populist Republican nominee that goes over there, and then automatically the Democrats have lost a lot of votes just because the black community, the Hispanic communities, even the Middle Eastern, they feel much more closer to what Trump, for instance, is saying in the United States. And the whole system has been manipulated. And I think that goes back to that definition. What was the definition of people, and how can we protect that? Because, the election, things can come and go, but the swing is huge. I wanted actually to ask you this question also.
Okay. So I think there's actually a couple of different questions embedded in the question that you asked. So the first question was about who are the people? That is to say, who is entitled to be part of the demos, right? So you asked, what is democracy? I mean, on some trivial, superficial level, democracy just means rule by the people, right? That's the sort of derivative etymologically, right? But there have been, over the course of history, right, huge debates about who the people are, right? So you mentioned the United States, that's an obvious case, right? So we have these beautiful founding documents. I still find, the sort of Declaration of Independence and the Constitution actually pretty exciting as a democratic scholar to read, because they're just sort of beautiful documents in the sense of really laying out some, I think, really timeless principles. The problem was not those principles. The problem was the view of, as you said, who the people were, right? So we had this sort of lovely democratic system, but we did not include all people who lived in the United States in our citizenry. And as you said, really primarily it was white men, and certainly the most disadvantaged, because they were not even treated as full human beings or full people, were African Americans. So in the United States, really, the debate has never been so much about democracy, although our democracy has changed in some ways over the course of the last, 250 years. Some institutions have changed. There have been amendments to our Constitution. The real change in the United States, the real action has been in the redefinition of who the people are. That is to say, who has the right to fully participate in political, social, and frankly also economic life in the United States. If you look at a place like Europe, it was in fact much more homogenous than the United States in many ways. And in fact, there's an incredible amount of ethnic cleansing that goes on in Europe around the Second World War. Europe is a much more, European countries are more homogenous in many ways after the Second World War than they are before. That's not only obviously because Jews have been eliminated, but in places like Eastern Europe, there's been an incredible amount of population transfers. So you have countries in 1948, let's say, that are much more nation states than they were before, in the sense of having one national group that largely dominates. Now, if one assumes that debates about the people are equally difficult, divisive, hard, as debates about, what should democracy look like, or even should we not have it, if you kind of homogenize your population, then you've eliminated one axis of discussion or debate. So this is a problem that the United States has had throughout its history, defining who the people are. But it's a problem that in some ways, many European countries have only had to grapple with recently. So they've had debates about, should we be democratic? Should we be authoritarian? But the question about, who has entitled to full citizenship, to full participation, that has been less an issue in Europe than it has been, for example, in the United States. So if you think again about, different axes, in the United States, we've always had, sort of on the paper, a democratic system, but we've not fully incorporated all the people who live in the United States into our sense of who the people are. In Europe, you've gone back and forth, many cycles of democracy versus dictatorship, democracy versus authoritarianism. But, the sort of boundaries of the political community of who a citizen was, that has changed less. And so what you have really now in Europe is a lot of new debates about that, and debates that there haven't historically been as many of. So let me sort of say that as in answer to your first question. Your second question is a little different, I would say. It's about, if I understood you correctly, how to understand why non-white people, to use a sort of very simplistic categorization, would vote for someone like Trump, or even, populists in Western Europe. And I think the key there is actually fairly simple. And the key really is, as you said, if you have certain kinds of cultural issues that are dominating political debate, different preferences will dominate folks' voting decisions. So in the United States, for instance, as you mentioned, actually African Americans, Hispanics, folks from the Middle East, these are generally folks who are much more conservative on social and cultural issues. That's almost entirely correlated with religiosity. So the reason why that is the case is because African Americans, Hispanics, and folks from different immigrant backgrounds tend to be much more religious than your sort of, median voter. And if you're conservative on social and cultural issues, then you sort of have a problem in the United States if you are, inclined to vote for Democrats, because they have historically, over the last decades, been the less racist or xenophobic party. But if you're thinking about social and cultural issues, abortion, the government's role vis-a-vis religion, transgender issues, gay rights issues, then you're going to start having attention. On the one hand, you're much closer to Trumpists and other populists on these culture war issues, but economically and in some other ways, you might be closer to the Democrats or the left. And so a lot of what's going on here with the tug back and forth with different immigrant groups in the United States and to some degree in Europe is a question of what kinds of issues are really dominating political debate. When folks go to the ballot box, what is primarily on their minds? Are they thinking about pocketbook issues, or are they thinking about, whether or not their kids are being turned into, transgender athletes kind of thing? I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but it's a serious issue. And so in the United States, one of the things that has happened, which is very dangerous, is the Trumpists, the Republican Party, has been very successful in getting folks focused on these cultural issues. And then what happens is more conservative voters, social and cultural conservatives, really then tend to look more favorably on the Republican Party, because it's seen as the party that is on that side of culture war issues. So, a lot of it, again, really has to do with what people are focused on, what their priorities are, what they think are the most important issues, facing the country today. In Europe, you can see this with regards to immigration, right? As long as immigration is like, the number one or two issue, facing different countries, you're going to see support for right-wing populist parties rise, because that's the issue that they are seen as sort of, most representative of. The less immigration is at the forefront of political debate, the less well these parties do, because they don't have particularly distinctive positions on economics. They're not seen as particularly trustworthy on those issues. It's really a lot, again, about what are the issues that are dominating voters' concerns when they go, voters' minds when they go to the ballot box.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
First of all, thank you, Professor Berman. It was very wonderful. We learned a lot, and I follow your works. I appreciate you are doing a lot. If I get it wrong, please correct me. You said that in the third group in Europe, the Social Democrats, and they believed that poor people didn't have enough knowledge to decide about democracy, and they didn't have time because they had to work a lot, and the state must protect them and create the circumstances to flourish democracy in Europe. I'm living in Norway, and as I read the Norwegian history, that right after the war, after the Second War, communists and social democrats had dominated in these countries. They won all elections. The parliament was dominated by the communists, but through time they lost the power. Generation after this post-war generation, they became more and more conservative and more right. My question is that not at the same time, I should say that the education developed, the people got more opportunities to read, to go to a school, to get higher education. But this new group with high education go to the right, and left lose all power. Even communist parties should disappear. They disappeared in almost all European countries. So what's the reason why couldn't left? You mentioned that the capitalism, the economic development, but is it only reason that this left couldn't keep it up, couldn't update themselves, be at time, be at day, and they lost power? Is it that, or is other reasons for that?
Okay, great. So let me start sort of just with the first thing that you mentioned. So, to get back to this question of sort of, poor people or underprivileged people in democracy. So what I was trying to say was that, one of the sort of distinctive things about social democrats, or let me say the, sort of post-war center left, social democratic parties, socialist parties, labor parties, yada, 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 was this idea that it was the government's, sort of duty to create conditions that would enable all people, individuals, regardless of their background, to sort of flourish and to fully participate in democracy. So that meant, for instance, expanding education. It meant ensuring people were not so economically impoverished or insecure that they didn't have time to kind of, focus on other things. So that was the kind of justification for a more activist state. This sort of gets back to sort of Puyan's point or question about, sort of positive versus negative liberty. So, and they were very successful in places, like Norway in particular, of sort of creating, more educational opportunities, more housing opportunities, leveling off economic inequality, and creating, again, a context within which, regardless of your background, you had the opportunities to kind of, become a full participant in society. So that's really a kind of crucial justification for the post-war, welfare state and a whole variety other things that's really a product of this kind of social democratic way of thinking, I would say. The question, then there's a second part of your question about sort of what happened to the left. I mean, the communist left, I think, is a sort of separate case because the communist left in the post-war period was kind of injured, so to speak, by its association with the Soviet Union, which became over time more and more of a burden as, sort of people began to realize that the Soviet Union was not this kind of, paradise, but was not only oppressive in its home, but also obviously oppressive elsewhere, crushing uprisings in parts of Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. And so that really hurt communist parties over time. And then in 1989, what was left of them kind of disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But your point is a good one, right? Which is that the left has sort of really declined both electorally and more broadly as a political force over the course of the last decades. I think this is a complicated question, but I think a crucial part of it is really its loss of its distinctive economic profile, right? So if you went back to the post-war decades in Europe, right, you would see these kind of, again, social democratic parties very much calling for the kinds of things we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? We need to have a state that protects citizens from the downsides of capitalism, that provides them with these opportunities to flourish, to grow, to become full members of society. And that is really what we as the left are here to provide, right? A party that champions this kind of view of we need to be kind of wary about capitalism, we need to protect citizens from it, and we need to make sure that we provide them with all of these programs and opportunities to enable them to flourish. You get by the 1990s a real shift in the economic profile of these left-wing parties, kind of along with or as part of the kind of broader, what is often referred to as a kind of shift towards neoliberalism that happened at the end of the 20th century. And if you sort of, if you're a political science and you kind of dig into the data, what you really begin to see happening is that what happens first is these center-left parties begin to lose many of their traditional voters, and those are really low educated, or rather, let me say, non-college educated and lower income voters really begin to kind of fall away from these parties in the late 20th century and early 21st century, as they are no longer seen by non-college educated and lower income voters as kind of really standing for them, as being their champions. And so these people begin to detach. And so these parties not only lose voters electorally, but they become increasingly dominated by a sort of higher educated elite that's less focused on economic issues. So especially in the 90s and early 2000s, very comfortable with certain aspects of neoliberalism, and much more focused on other kinds of issues, green issues, issues about identity. And this really creates this kind of wedge on the left, pushing, again, a lot of working class voters away. In 10 years or so, especially after the financial crisis, a lot of these voters found themselves voting for right-wing populist parties. So, the story of the decline of the left is a complicated one, but I think the 90s are really kind of a hinge decade because they really changed the profile of the left, what the left was seen as standing for, and how many voters therefore viewed what it meant to be on the left, right? Up through that point, really left meant an economic left. After the 1990s, the left didn't look that different economically from center-right parties, Christian democratic parties, conservative parties, and it became increasingly associated with non-economic issues, which was just not able to sustain it as much electorally as its kind of traditional appeals had.
Can I ask a question in this relation? The success of the Social Democrats was based on a Keynesian political economy. But as you know, in the 70s, we lose this camp against this neoliberal. And going to the Social Democratic Party and say that you should focus more on the economic issues, they ask me, with which political economy? should we go back to the Keynesian politic? It's not possible. So the reason that you have written in your article in Foreign Policy about the Social Democrats turn to the middle was that they couldn't continue with this kind of Keynesian political economy. What's the alternative now, according to you?
Right. So that's also really a good question, right? So one of the reasons why you have this kind of economic shift on the left in the late 20th century, in the 1990s in particular, I'm old enough to remember, I imagine many of you are, sort of, you know, the hullabaloo about, you know, sort of third wave politics in the United States. It was called, you know, the New Democrats or progressive neoliberalism, which is clearly not, doesn't make any sense. But you know, again, part of the reason for that shift was that a lot of the policies and institutions that had worked very well during those post-war decades, as you said, by the end of the 20th century, they were not working very well anymore because capitalism had changed. It's a sort of, you know, the economic system changes over time. And so things that worked well in the 1960s did not work so well in the 1980s or 1990s. And for that and other reasons, again, you sort of see a left that kind of says, okay, look, we're just going to adopt these kind of neoliberal policies because they're the, you know, they're the kind of wave of the future. Now, I think from 2025, we can see that neoliberalism was not as successful as its advocates in the late 20th century said. You know, we have societies that are characterized by still very slow growth, rising not only economic, but geographic inequality in Europe, extreme forms of economic insecurity. So the promises of neoliberalism turned out to be really not fulfilled, despite the enthusiasm for them on both the center left and the right. So the question then is, you know, sort of what's the alternative, right? You know, so how do you create an economy in 2025 and beyond that protects citizens from these downsides of capitalism, to kind of use the older terminology, but not killing the goose that lays the golden egg, right? Without growth, without innovation, very little can get done. And, you know, I don't think that's at all impossible, but policies clearly cannot be the same as they were in the 60s and 70s. So for instance, again, you know, you have to have policies that, you know, as was traditionally the case in Sweden, that don't lock people in particular jobs. You understand that today people are going to move from job to job. You can't, as it remains the instinct in places like France and Italy, industries that are no longer viable in an advanced industrial country, these are not industries that should be protected because they are not going to be economically viable over the long term. But neither can you just say to people, look, you know, you have been making steel or mining coal for decades, and now all of a sudden that's going to disappear, and we expect you to just kind of roll with the punches. That obviously is not viable either. You are absolutely going to get backlashes. So figuring out ways to put in place welfare state policies that help people adjust to change rather than trying to stop it, that is clearly the wave of the future, that integrate people into labor markets as opposed to simply paying them for sitting at home. Again, this is a long-standing kind of thing that was very prominent in Scandinavian countries. We have someone here from both Sweden and Norway, right? The idea that you would just simply hand out unemployment paychecks to people without any obligation to kind of continually look for a job, that is obviously not a viable long-term solution. So I think there are absolutely policies out there that are compatible with the kinds of economies we have in 2025 that are not the same as they would have been in the 60s and 70s, but still very much recognize that, you know, you have to protect people from these negative economic consequences, but also have to help them adjust to the nature of the economy today.
Susan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, yes, if you allow me. You mentioned the welfare system. I have long experience from the Norwegian welfare system. As you said before, in 20th century, the welfare system was very strong, but it didn't put any condition for their aids for people. But now this welfare system changes, get more difficult. put conditions for people who are using this welfare system. The regard to that, the right gets stronger and stronger in our countries, in Sweden, in Norway. Even now, people are angry to the system sometimes, but they are more angry to the Labour Party than to the right party. And they blame them in many things. And for me, this is very difficult to understand that why, because the situation in some way can be similar to after war, that poverty growing in these countries. But people are choosing right side. More of them, most of them. And what can be reason that even now Norway has, for example, 60% of the Norwegian population has education at the high school or university level, but they are more individualist. They are thinking about their own pocket and how much they can get. But at the same time, they believe that the right side can give them what they want. So what is the reason for that?
So, I mean, that's a great question. Let me say that more generally, part of the problem, not specifically in Norway, but I would say in a lot of other European countries, has to do with something you mentioned at the beginning, right? Which is it gets very hard to sustain support for the welfare state if people perceive, and that perception is not always true, but if people perceive that it's being abused or that government resources are, are limited, and somebody else, so to speak, is getting resources that you believe you are more entitled to. So what does that mean concretely? Part of the interaction here is, right, that you've had these kind of confluence of changes going on in Europe. And again, Norway is a kind of a special case because it remains so incredibly wealthy because of oil and its sort of after effects. But you've had this kind of perception in a lot of places that isn't entirely true, but is not also entirely false, that you have had people who have come in and used the welfare state's resources at a time when those resources are under pressure, and they're not fully participating in the labor market. And that is a very bad situation for the left to be in, right? Because that welfare state can only be sustained if people are working and if people don't feel like, some other group is getting more out of the system than they are putting in. So, I mean, part of the reason for this is that there's this confluence, as I said, between, sort of people who have come in, the changing demographics of European societies, and this sense that, the welfare state is being used to support these folks as opposed to, folks who, were born there or something like that. So, I mean, that is the kind of dynamic that the right really thrives on. And so, a kind of a smart left would say, look, the welfare state is there to support and protect everyone. But in return for that, right, you have to be constantly looking for a job. You have to, re-educate yourself for whatever jobs are out there on the market. You must pay taxes. I mean, these are not unreasonable trade-offs. And the fact that, people on the left forgot that this was part of the way that the welfare state could be sustained. That is to say, everybody had to be seen to not only benefit from it, but be contributing to it. This is the kind of situation that the left can't allow to happen, because, as you said, then people look to the right when they think that government resources are going to folks who are not fully participating in the labor market or fully participating in society in other important ways.
I ask a question here about, sorry, my last question. And that's, I guess it's a interesting point you made, but I want to clarify that. These people are using quote unquote welfare state. The country, like in this this example of this European country, they do not consider them skilled labor because of the issue of assimilation. They can participate, but the issue is somewhere else. Because if you come to the United States, even if you are illegal, because we don't have a welfare state, people have to work. They have to work. They do a black work and the government doesn't basically monitor them. And the issue of assimilation in the United States is not the way that Europe has. So my question here is, this welfare state is under pressure. Is it state-made pressure because they say that, okay, you come to this country, you're going to learn the language, you're going to become Swedish, Norwegian, German, whatever it is, then you can participate in the labor market the way we tell you. But considering some of the immigrants are coming from a country that are technically skilled labor, they may not know the language that well, or they could do something else. Does the society allow them to be part of labor market or not?
So that's a great question, and it varies from country to country, right? So some of it is, and I think this is what you're getting at, some of it is kind of a self-inflicted wound. So for example, take the German case, right? So in Germany, when asylum seekers or refugees come, they're not allowed to work. As you said, in the United States, the minute someone comes here, they're working in a bodega or they're working in a gas station or something like that. And that's, because you don't have a choice in the United States, right? Like you either do that or you're kind of out on the street. And sometimes you do that and you're still out on the street. But, in a lot of European countries, folks come and they're not allowed to work. And this creates a kind of vicious cycle, right? Because they don't work. And so native born citizens become resentful of them because they think that they're just, using government resources, but they're actually not allowed to work. So some of that is kind of self-created. Some of it is also a kind of a time and consistency problem. Political scientists love fancy terminology. What do I mean by a time and consistency problem? So I have here, several what I imagine to be highly educated Iranians. Now, if you look at the data on highly educated immigrants, regardless of what their background is, they come from the Middle East, they're Muslim, they're not Muslim, they have dark skin, they have lighter skin. If they are highly educated and they come to whatever country it is, Britain, Sweden, Norway, actually, not only do they quote unquote integrate relatively quickly, but they're not actually what people are upset about. So, a good comparison, Pooyan, would be, Canada versus the United States, right? Canada, up until recently, had a very strict point system that very clearly selected for highly educated, actually fairly well-resourced immigrants. Now, I think Canada is probably a kinder, nicer place than the United States, certainly today. But, if you are disproportionately getting immigrants who come to your country with significant economic resources and significant education, and then you tout the fact that you don't have an immigration backlash, I think that's great. But, it's comparing apples and oranges, right? So why do I bring this up? Because in addition to the challenge of growing diversity in Europe, what you had over the past 10 years, particularly concentrated around the refugee crisis in 2015 and 16, is not only large numbers of immigrants coming, but immigrants who are coming from very low education backgrounds, places like Syria, Afghanistan. And so in addition to dealing just with a huge demographic shift, you are dealing with people who almost by definition were going to be more difficult to integrate into the labor market than, again, folks like, like the people who are here are. And that just creates a whole variety of new challenges on top of the other ones. Now, when I said time and consistency, what does this mean? Over time, we know that, even if you come to a country without a college education, without speaking the language, without many economic resources, over time, most folks do end up integrating into the labor market and their children end up doing, even better. But the problem is that that's a long-term problem, right? Or rather, it's a longer term process. And so for European countries that over the last 10 years, or even more since the financial crisis, have been dealing with very severe economic and financial problems, and then had this huge influx of more lower educated folks, this is just, a compounding problem that, again, has sort of created a whole variety of downstream political challenges.
Can I have an objection to this last? The question is more complicated than this, because, for example, there are a lot of studies that demonstrate that people from Afghanistan have in higher rate jobs than many other groups of immigrants now, because they accept the simplest, the hardest job that you can get. But in Sweden, for example, we have a lot of people from Poland who are working in the construction sector. And construction sector has been a very white, man-dominated sector with very high salary and status. And now they lose their status, and they hate these Polish immigrants who are getting their job. Number two, we have a lot of people with Roma origin from Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, who are coming here and are begging in the streets. So I mean, the European Union construction and the free movement of people is one of the question that is not so easy to handle. And that's my objection to the story that you told us now.
No, I think that's an important point. And it sort of circles back to some of the other questions that were asked. There's absolutely tons of racism and xenophobia in Europe and in the United States. That's a given. But as a small d Democrat, as a person who cares about democracy, who cares about human rights, what we should want to do is we should want to figure out what the heart of the problem is, so that we can deal with we can deal with it better, right? So what you point out is really crucial, right? Which is that there are a lot of people who object to immigration, but not for racist or clearly racist or xenophobic reasons, right? They object because they don't want, for instance, Poles coming into the construction industry and taking jobs at lower wages than they have gotten. For example, for those of you, again, who've been living in Europe for a long time, I mean, as you well know, that up through the end of the 20th century, the left actually was not very pro-immigration. It was very concerned about immigration, not for racist or xenophobic reasons, but precisely for this reason, right? Which is they were very concerned about protecting wages, about protecting unionized jobs, and they feared that letting in too many immigrants would threaten, wages and unionization, right? Now, for instance, if you look at Brexit, the backlash there was to immigrants who were coming precisely, as you said, Ali Reza, from Eastern Europe. So they were white, but they didn't like these folks coming in. They didn't like them, again, taking what they thought were their jobs, and particularly taking their jobs at lower wages, right? And if you look more generally, for people, sociologists, political scientists, who have done these kind of both statistical, survey, and ethnographic investigations, there are a lot of people who, when you dig down to it, their objections to immigration are not racist and xenophobic. There are a lot of those people. There are. But for a lot of people, it really focuses on these economic issues, right? I don't want these people here undercutting my wages. I don't want these people here taking away government resources at a time when budgets are strained, right? Now, those kinds of latter objections, those can be dealt with by people on the left or small d Democrats, right? Because there, what you're dealing with is focusing on economic issues around which new policies, better policies can be structured, right? People who are racist or xenophobic, they're not going to want different people in their country, regardless of whether they're doctors or, people who are washing dishes, right? Those people cannot be reached by the left or by small d Democrats. But the people who are concerned about their wages, who are concerned about access to government resources, those people actually one can deal with by, again, thinking about structuring policies differently, right? So, one thing actually that I do not have a problem with in places like, and by the way, Sweden and Britain were only two of the three countries that allowed this kind of free flow of labor from Eastern Europe when these countries joined. Other countries did not allow it precisely for this reason. Is saying, look, if you come here from wherever it is, Poland, the minimum wage has to be raised, right? Because if you come here, you cannot be earning less, significantly less than whatever, a native-born Swede, because that's a problem. It's a problem economically, and it's a problem socially, because it's bound to create the kind of negative dynamics that you pointed out. And so the desire should be by the left to not only raise the wages of everyone, but as you also said in your earlier comment, right, the more everyone, Afghans, anyone who comes to the country is integrated into the labor market, the better. Right now in Sweden, there's still a somewhat significant difference in labor force participation rates between immigrants and native-born Swedes, right? You want that difference to disappear, because the more that disappears, the less conflict you're going to have by people who, again, whose concerns are primarily economic, as opposed to, again, the sort of racists and xenophobes who are not going to be helped by anything, right? You want to eliminate those economic concerns, because those are the people who can be dealt with, and it's better for everyone for those kind of differences not to exist.
Thank you. I guess we can have one more question if Susan want to ask last question.
But I will continue this discussion. You mentioned that is not necessarily racism, but after the Ukraine war, it came a lot of people from Ukraine to Central Europe and North Europe, and they will be treated very privileged. And when we ask why, they said because they are Europeans. But people from Poland don't have the same privilege as Ukrainian people. And Ukrainian and Syrian people, Ukrainian people, they are high educated people among them. Ukrainian people, most of them deny to work. Even they get more opportunity than other immigrants in North Europe, but they deny to work. But Syrian people or Iranian people, most of them are with high education in these countries. They don't get what they actually are qualified for. They must take very, very low paid jobs and they take it. Right. Because I am working in the welfare system, I have long experience, and that was something we discussed a lot in Norway. Why Ukrainian people should have privileged situation in here? We don't get any answer, and the policy was totally forced down. They believe that they are going to come in the labor market very fast and they're going to participate. It didn't happen. And for me, this is a racism. No, and I always argue in Norway that this is a racism. Why? Because they are white. They are characterized as white. And it doesn't matter which color is my skin. I am not white. I am a black in Norway, so, no matter what.
Look, I mean, those are all fair points. I would say two things. One is there was obviously initially incredible sympathy, if not sort of enthusiastic embrace of refugees from Ukraine. Over time, however, you have seen in some countries, I don't know as much about Ukrainians in Norway as I do in some other places. Over time, however, you've seen similar kinds of backlashes to them, as you've seen, for instance, as Ali Reza said, to some of the other immigrants from Eastern Europe, right? Precisely for that reason, because, there was immense sympathy for them initially, maybe because they were seen as white by some people, but also because, they were seen as obviously fleeing this conflict that was right on Europe's borders. But over time, that sympathy is diminished precisely as people have begun to see them as, sort of more of a drain on resources. So you've begun to see that dynamic, despite the fact that they are quote unquote, white, which is funny because of course, as your question, I think implicitly indicates, who's defined as white kind of changes over time.
Exactly.
But, as they have become more of a sort, or seen as being more of an economic burden, that enthusiasm has waned. And again, I don't know as much about Ukrainians in Norway, but that's certainly true in other European countries, including Germany, for example, where there are obviously a lot of Ukrainians. The other thing is, and this is a totally different issue, is the question of kind of what exactly refugee status means. I mean, for the Ukrainians, the initial hope, which turned out unfortunately not to be true, is that these were folks who were coming and then they were going to go back pretty quickly, right? Like this was, there was a war, it was going to last for, whatever, a year or two, and then the Ukrainians were absolutely going to go back. That assumption is not really true, or wasn't true initially with a lot of the folks who came from other places. And that also created somewhat different dynamics. Again, I don't know as much about the Norwegian welfare system in other places where, there was a difference between dealing with people who you thought were sort of, kind of long-term visitors, but were absolutely going back to their country, as opposed to people who you were like, look, they're here, we don't know if they're ever going back. So those also created somewhat different dynamics, not just among the way welfare states dealt with them, but also I think the way citizens viewed them. Again, the longer they were there and seen as not fully participating, the more problematic they became.
Yeah, exactly. It's true.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the time, Professor, you gave us. And we tried to publish this podcast quickly. And thank you very much.
And thank you, Pooya. Thank you very much, Sherry, for sharing your time with us. I have read a lot of your books, and it was an opportunity to see you live.
Yeah, I started to read your works, Professor برمن, because I didn't know you before I met Pooya, and now I follow you, and I read. I enjoy it really. Very, very good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
For
Thank
your
you so
time.
much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.